Hello, I'm Emilie Bellet, founder of Vestpod and author of You're Not Broke, You're Pre-Rich, and you're listening to The Wallet. Every week, we bring you the best tips, guidance, and a good dose of inspiration and motivation to manage your money better. Today's episode is about money, work, and the decisions that quietly change the direction of a career. My guest, Nicole Michler, went from earning about £27,000 a year to building financial independence. And we unpack what actually changed along the way. We talk about the first decisions that move the needle, what it means to uncondition yourself from limiting beliefs, and which money and career stories she had to actively unlearn before her income could grow. Nicole, it's amazing to have you on The Wallet today. We're going to talk about career, about negotiation. But for anyone listening, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I run Phase 20, a global education platform for women working in corporate. And we offer leadership readiness coaching, salary negotiation training, as well as general career strategy advice for women that do work in very heavily competitive corporate environments. I think quite often what we find is that we are not being given the strategies and the tactics that we really need to really thrive in our careers. And a lot of women do overcompensate by working even harder, proving themselves even more, saying yes to even more tasks. And we work really closely with women to help them create calculated career strategies that really get them quickly into those leadership roles and that really help them to negotiate those six-figure salaries with confidence.
So I'm super happy to have you today because, as I was saying before, in our little catch-up, we talk a lot about saving, we talk a lot about investing, how to allocate your money. But the starting point very often is how much money do you make? And I know you've been sharing your story, and there's a lot of super interesting things we can cover today. But maybe if I take you to the early days in your 20s, if you can tell me maybe your level of earnings and how, did life look like at this stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually stuck on a 27K salary for the longest time in my early career days. I share that story a lot because it really stuck with me because life back then actually was very restrictive. I remember really, working from paycheck to paycheck and having to double check my bank account at the end of the month to be able to even, go to the grocery store and, use the 10 last pounds that I had on my bank account to go and buy groceries. I remember having to say no to social events because I had to wait for payday, how I had to really save up to go on a holiday. All of these aspects of life were not really what I had imagined for myself. Having come from a top university in Germany, having studied all these years to land in a corporate career that had promised, big paychecks and all these great things. And it didn't quite match up to my expectations at that point.
And what do you think was holding you back at the time? You said you were stuck on the same salary for a long time.
I think it came down to two things, really. One was the lack of confidence in talking about money and especially talking about my salary with my employer. In fact, I remember the company actively disencouraged us from talking openly about our salary, especially with colleagues. So that was one aspect. The second one was that I was not aware or didn't clearly understand my worth. I had an idea that I was owed more. I knew there was, definitely a need to address this, but I just didn't know how to. I didn't know exactly how to validate my market value at the time. And I think quite honestly, I think especially in the early days in our career, we oftentimes lack that guidance in terms of how we can actively really validate what we should be paid. And I definitely felt that at that point.
And do you think there was a specific time when you decided, things that I have to change, I have to be paid, what I'm worth, or?
Yes, I think the first time I had sort of like an aha moment was when we actually ended up talking about our salary amongst the team. I remember there was one situation where we were all pulled into a meeting room and we were told, hey, you guys all got a pay rise, great news. But once you leave the room, do not talk to each other about what that pay rise was. So you can imagine a bunch of us were like, oh, leaving the room. And now we're actually curious. What salary are you actually on? So we started talking to each other about that. And what I found back then really shook me because we were effectively all doing the same role. We were all in one team, but we were all on different salaries. And that not based on the performance or the output necessarily, but I found that colleagues that were just, shouting and were like really connected to the top were on the top salaries. And I just remember how unfair that felt and how undervalued I felt at that moment. And that changed a lot for me.
So what was your next step after maybe having this conversation with colleagues?
I had to finally step outside of my comfort zone and actually start talking about my salary with my manager. So the next step for me was to book that one-to-one with my manager. And I think that can most of the times be the scariest step really to go and speak to your manager about your salary if you don't know how to or how to really negotiate. And I see that quite a lot, with the women that I work with that are looking to address their salary that just don't really feel that confidence. And I had one example of an incredibly talented woman that I work with in Switzerland who hadn't brought up her pay for 2 years just out of fear that she could cause an inconvenience or like she could be an annoyance to her manager to bother him with her salary. So she didn't. And the first thing we had to do back then was to actually actively address this and change her mindset around how it is necessary to bring it up, that you have to drive this conversation. And the second thing we did was to work on her positioning and how to go into the meeting and how to still be her authentic self, but to, really make a point here that this needs to be addressed. And, she walked out with a 10K raise the
Amazing.
same day. It was incredible. And that's how overdue it was. So I think coming back to your question, I think sometimes, we hold ourselves back, but maybe you end up being surprised because at the end of the day, if you talk about it, you might end up walking outside of the meeting with a pay rise.
It's interesting you talked about money mindset. That's something we cover very often at Vestpod on the wallet, because I think your money story, the beliefs you have about money, the stories you tell yourself, they'll have such a big impact on your actions, on your habits. And I think you're talking, I heard you talk about how to uncondition yourself. Can you tell me talking about your own story, what change did you have to make in terms of money mindset?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was all down the whole conditioning and unconditioning part. It was all down to the environment that I actually grew up in. So I grew up in Germany, and the story that I'd been telling myself for the longest time was: you go to school, you then go to university, you get a job, and that job is then gonna pay for your standard life, like the flat that you rent, a holiday here and there, and you call it a day. And when I came to the UK, I was lucky enough to actually be surrounded by a bunch of really incredible and inspiring people that even in their early 20s started talking about how they're lining up their savings to buy their first property.
Yeah.
That was something I had not been exposed to, this thought even. I had colleagues that were starting to talk about how they're going to start their own business and how they're going to go down that entrepreneurial route. All of these different thoughts and ideas helped me to understand, oh, there is not just this one path or this one track that you can take in life, but there's actually alternative ways. And there's also alternative ways to think about money and to envision what is actually possible for you in your life. And I saw these people around me making all these big, bold plans for themselves. And I was like, if they can do that, I can do that too. And that was sort of this sort of starting point to really uncondition myself from the environment that I grew up in to believe that I can also have a better life.
So there's a lot to unlearn and then to, learn something else. So you talked about environment. Was there, something else? How did you then, get started to really try to change this more like fixed mindset, maybe to a more growth mindset?
I think there were like a bunch of limiting beliefs that were holding me back at the time. And the way I looked at money and the way I kind of understood sort of my salary journey, And the way I didn't give myself permission to ask for more, even though I felt, as I said, I was owed it. So a belief that I actively had to unlearn was this idea that I had to be more experienced to ask for more. I had to prove myself more to ask for more. And somewhere along that journey, I also sort of got to this idea that age also was a determining factor. So I thought if you are working really hard and you're at a certain age, the money will naturally increase and, happy days. But that's obviously not the case.
No.
And I had a really, really interesting conversation with one of my colleagues years later in my career who actually said to me at the time, Nicole, like you are bringing in one highly visible, important project after the next. The company is relying on you so heavily right now. Right now, you actually have leverage to go and ask for a pay rise. Don't wait until you have delivered all of this work. Do it right now. And that was a moment where I thought, I don't have to wait anymore. I don't have to prove myself harder. I can actually go and ask for this now. But I needed to just kind of, unlearn this idea that I had to wait, that my age was a factor here. And I also started to really look into my market value for once. I know I started kind of like thinking about it in my early 20s, but until I really started to do my research and understand, okay, so what's a competitive company willing to offer for someone in my role with my experience, my years? What are my colleagues earning for the same responsibilities and the same value that they bring to the business? And I started to collect all these numbers. And they were all way higher than the salary that I was currently on. I was really angry. I was really upset at that point. And I used that emotion to use it as fuel to actually go and challenge my pay at the time. And I think that is something that I would, encourage everyone to do, is like to really look into their market value and get the data ready to understand what the gap really is in terms of their payment versus where they should be.
So I'd love to talk a little bit more about how you prepared for these meetings, how to understand your market value, do your research. But maybe if we stay on this idea of changing your mindset, do you think your relationship with risk also changed as your mindset changed? I mean, you're now an entrepreneur. You left, your full-time job, so that's like a massive change. So, what is your relationship to risk now?
Yes, it definitely changed the older I got and also the more experienced I got. But mostly the more, I actually really looked into these important facts like what my market value really is. And I started this whole journey of reaching out to other companies, not to put a competitive offer on my manager's plate, but to validate my own sort of worth. And I also learned that, with the years, my network grew. So I now had alternatives. I had other colleagues that had moved on to different companies. There were, all these doors that were opening up. And I understood that I was actually, I was a hot asset in the market. Companies were, lining up to work with me. And at the end of the day, I understood that I needed to work with my employer to actually create a sort of like win-win situation where I was happy with the pay in exchange for the value and the expertise that I would bring. I have one of my friends that is also, she's also in leadership, and she always says to me, Nicole, I always have you in my ear when I negotiate my contracts, because she said this win-win idea is so crucial. When she stepped into leadership, she was offered this pay or compensation package, and she said, I wasn't happy with that in that moment. And I had you in my ear, and I just thought, I'm stepping up, I'm taking on additional responsibilities, long working hours, I'm now managing a team. But if I don't feel happy with my pay, then that's not a win-win for me. So I need to address this. And that's exactly how I feel about it. So it's actually essential to bring it up with your employer if you are not feeling that you are compensated the way you should be, because at the end of the day, it's in the interest of your company that you are motivated, that you are, that your work ethic obviously shines, and that you are, bringing that commitment to the business. And in order to do so, you need to feel fairly treated, and your payment is an essential and crucial part to that.
And you've talked about one woman who got like a 10K, pay rise. You often talk about getting this next 5K, and people think, oh, but it's just 5K. Or, I mean, it really depends on what's your base salary. But how much should we ask, and where do you start? Where is the cursor in terms of how much money you should be asking?
Yes, I think when I work with women and address their salary with them, I don't actually start with the numbers. I typically start with their personal goals. And I go even further than that. I don't just, ask them, where would you like to go on holiday next year? I actually ask them to really think about the next decade and where they really want to see themselves. And the reason I do that is because if we think just about the next year or the next 2 years, we oftentimes limit ourselves to what is possible based on where we are today. But if we remove all of those limitations and we really think ahead and we take all these, barriers away, it allows you to really think freely and bigger for yourself. And I experienced that in a workshop that I held about financial independence. And when I asked the women in the audience, if you had all the money in the world today, what would you be doing right now? And women were just, a bit stopped in their track in the tracks right at that moment, because they were like, I would just go for a walk right now, or I would just go on a weekend trip somewhere. They just didn't have this sort of broader idea of what life could look like. And that's what I'm trying to do with this exercise, where I really think about sort of the future. And to take that back to your question about, why do £5,000 matter? If you are very, very clear about why those £5,000 really matter, if you reverse engineer one of those bigger visions and bigger goals for yourself, it all of a sudden doesn't become or it's no longer a nice to have to ask for those £5,000. Now it's personal, it's deeply rooted, and it's deeply connected to your why and what you're looking to work on in your life. And if you now go ahead and you walk into the negotiation and you really fight for those £5,000, and let's say you come out on the other side and you successfully negotiated those £5,000, you now have learned something really important, which is how to successfully negotiate. And you have applied principles that you can now use to actually go and ask for £10,000 next time, or £20,000. Like the £5,000 is something that compounds, because now you have not just asked for £5,000, but you are working towards your bigger goals, but also now you have the confidence to ask for more next time.
And why a lot of people don't actually take this step of asking for the next £5,000? What is the biggest barrier?
Yeah, I think one goes back to us not making it a priority enough. So many times what I find is a lot of people focus on I gonna go and ask for the promotion and the salary is gonna naturally increase. Or I gonna go and try and land that new role and then I deal with the salary talk whenever it comes up. Barely anyone leads with the salary conversation. I think that is one big challenge that I see. It's an afterthought in many cases. The other challenge I see is when it comes to asking for those £5,000 in addition, is that we don't really know how or when to bring it up successfully. What I mean by that is I have a lot of these conversations around when to actually position that pay rise. And a lot of times I hear feedback or statements like, I'm going to wait until the performance review is due, or I need to deliver that project first and then I have something to show for. And that's where you put yourself already into a weak position. So when you wait for, let's say, for the performance review, and for everyone having their performance review at the exact same time, you are basically putting yourself into the most vulnerable, weakest spot possible, because now you're being compared to an entire company of people that are also asking for their pay rise. Second of all is, at that point, your company is probably very sort of narrow-minded in the sense that they think of their typical 5%, 8%, annual pay rises that they're willing to give. So now you're in this like tiering system and band system and all these conversations around why this pay rise cannot be beyond 5% or 8%, whatever it is. The other challenge around that is, let's say, you bring it up not in a review cycle, but off cycle, great. What I want you to do is to not wait until you deliver that project, because now you've given away all your leverage.
Yes.
And all the urgency around your request is also gone because you've given the company everything they wanted and you are still standing there and like hoping for the best. So the best time to really bring it up is when you have something up your sleeves, when there's something that you are working on that's highly visible, that your management is counting on and their neck is on the line. If you don't deliver this, that's the time when you should bring up that pay rise.
This episode is supported by Vestpod. At Vestpod, we help women build money confidence with clear, practical guidance, not jargon. From getting your finances organized, to investing, to building long-term habits that actually stick. You'll find accessible courses, useful tools, and summaries of our podcast episodes, all designed to help you make better decisions without feeling overwhelmed. Sign up to our weekly newsletter, The Edit, at vestpod.com/subscribe. So you've talked about a few tactics and mistakes, but what's, according to you, the biggest mistake that people make when asking for more?
Yes, the biggest mistake that I see is when we don't fully qualify the full earnings potential of a role before we share our own expectations. So taking us back to the scenario that you are going for a new role, for example, and you're being asked by the hiring manager or the recruiter, what is your salary expectation? The worst thing you can do in that moment is to just simply give them a number, because now you have shared a number that is completely out of context of what the company is technically willing to offer, which could be way more than what you just mentioned. The second reason why this is a problem is because now you have set a negotiation anchor around this number that you just mentioned. And this naturally becomes sort of the top range for the further negotiations. So it's going to be very difficult for you to negotiate beyond that number at this point. So the best thing to do in this scenario is actually to pick up that question, to turn it around, and to ask them first what they are willing to pay for this role. So to say something like, thanks so much for addressing my salary expectations. Before I can go into detail here, can you please share what the budget range is for this role? Now they're going to give you a range and you can use that information to negotiate up from there.
I mean, I write it down because I think that's so important, especially for like a first conversation about salary, not to really, undervalue yourself. This is maybe a big question, but for, someone listening who feels, they've been underpaid for a long period of time, they may be worried now also about the process, because it's a company maybe they love their, their role there, their colleagues, their boss, and they don't really know how to approach this tricky conversation. You feel it's very personal, it can be very emotional. So what would be for you the first steps to help them get this pay rise?
Yes, I think the first thing I would do is to actually remind myself of the fact that logically, like, you are in a work agreement and in a work contract, and that contract says you are bringing your expertise, your time, your skills, your commitment to the company in exchange of a salary. And what typically happens is you start that role and you then start adding additional responsibilities. You are perhaps, now working on really highly visible client projects or highly valuable projects that are, very valuable to the business in general, or you have maybe acquired additional qualifications or certifications. So in other words, you are, as part of this journey, you are increasing your own market value. But if your salary has not, caught up with that, then that needs to be addressed. And typically we don't really speak about our salary every day. But if you haven't had a conversation, let's say in the last 6 months, then it's definitely something that you should bring up, because your company is not going to do that for you, right?
Yes.
But there's absolutely zero risk in you asking for that meeting with your manager, bringing that up with your manager to address your salary expectations. And in fact, I think it actually is great if you do that, because it shows executive presence, and that is something that you really want to demonstrate whenever you can.
And what if you ask, but you actually don't get a salary increase? What are your options?
I think the most important thing here is to understand your options, first of all, exactly. I would always advise that you get to the root cause of like what that hesitation is all about. Because quite often we do hear no, but we hear no for various reasons. And it's your job to kind of find out what it is. Is it because there's really no budget at the moment? Is it because there is a sort of not a deep understanding of what value you really bring to the business? Is it because your manager maybe wants to have an easy life and is just not willing to actually go that extra mile right now to like go through all the approvals, that you need in order to, get an off-cycle sort of like appraisal or performance review or, pay rise? There are different routes and different reasons to it. So it's your job to find that out, to then come again to a mutually beneficial agreement with your employer. At the end of the day, your company, it's in their interest that you are happy, that you are motivated. Remind yourself of that because, the output that you bring, the value that you bring is in their interest. So it goes back to what I said earlier. You need to create that win-win.
Yeah, I think the win-win is super important. And you've also you talk about money, but you also talk a lot about leadership, because that's really important that you have your agency, you're actually stepping up. So can you talk about the changes, how you thought about this like leadership and progression in parallel to, of course, getting more money?
Yes, I think that was a very, very important step for me personally as well, is to kind of get myself into the mindset of feeling ready to step into leadership. And the first step I did take was to actively work on my confidence, to kind of get myself into the sort of mindset that I am ready. Even if the title doesn't reflect it yet, I am ready. And I did that by logically showing and proving to myself that I had delivered all of these additional projects, responsibilities, skill sets that are effectively all demonstrating leadership readiness. So I created sort of, just a piece of paper that showed my skills, my accomplishments, my competitive edge. It had quantifiable data. It had specific examples that I could mention in conversations with management that showcased my readiness for this position. And I think quite often what we find is that we hold ourselves back for far too long, even though we feel we are ready for this next step. But like something in our mind is just like holding us back, like a limiting belief or something. So having these late data points are crucial in stepping into that next level.
I don't know how you approach it, but for me, for example, it's a little bit different as an entrepreneur, but you also have to negotiate your value, negotiate your prices. I think keeping track of everything you do, as you say, record everything, have your data, and not wait until the end of the year, or as you say, maybe until your review to actually write it down. How do you keep track of all your achievements?
Yeah, I typically have like spreadsheets and just little trackers that I create that basically um, showcase what I've been working on, and I review them typically every month. So I make like a me hour. I create a blocker in the calendar, and I just go through everything that I've worked on that month, from little tiny projects to um, like moments where I was really proud of myself. And all of this combined, this creates this sort of like track record exactly that you need in order to then go and walk into these like conversations with management with confidence. And what I also always say is, put yourself into your management's shoes, because if you have forgotten about half of the stuff that you've worked on and these great examples, your management won't know. So
Yeah.
it's your job to actually point them in the right direction and, showcase all of these incredible results and examples.
Now on, if we take a step back and we've been talking about money, about understanding your worth, asking for more, and I got a question this week at an event. Someone saying, we live in this capitalistic society where how much we earn, it's our price tag and it defines who we are. So I think it's really important that we also separate our net worth with what we earn. We all live in, we all work in like different industries where the earning capacity is probably not the same. But what you've been talking about is that money is just a tool. It's probably just a tool that will help you to achieve your long-term goals, and that's why you're starting with goals. Can you talk a little bit about this relationship between earning more and financial independence?
Definitely. I think that was a very important sort of learning curve for me as well. Again, talking about unconditioning myself from thinking of, having to work really hard for money, but actually, doing it the other way around and letting money work for you. And it all started off with me reading it's such a cliche, but me reading a book in my early 20s, Rich Dad Poor Dad, which kind of sparked this curiosity around what life could look like if you actually gain financial independence and you let money work for you. And yeah, that journey just completely, or that me reading that book changed everything completely. And it sparked, yeah, as I said, this sort of like learning curve, which I'm still on. I'm still learning about money and I'm still learning about how I can be smarter with it. But I think that is sort of like the first step in the right direction when you start actively educating yourself around a topic that you might not be familiar with at this point. But as I said, there are different paths that I started to realize there are around how you can live your life, how you can be financially independent, how you can be completely dependent or independent from an employer. I think that is also a very, very important topic I'd like to talk about quite oftenly, because quite often we just, again, work and live from paycheck to paycheck, and that puts you into a vulnerable position when you think about maybe wanting to leave a work environment, maybe because you don't feel valued, maybe because it's a toxic work environment, and now you're kind of like stuck. And you want to be in a position where money doesn't become the determining factor around, you not being able to leave, but you have a security fund,
Mhm.
perhaps you have savings somewhere that allow you to take that step and make decisions that feel more aligned with where you are, or, where you want to be.
I also read Rich Dad Poor Dad when I started this journey about Vestpod, because I think this relationship between, as you say, employer and the difference between earning money and saving money and making your money work hard for you is super important. And understanding that you need to build some assets, so you need to save money that will then generate money and slowly replace your income is yeah, I mean, everybody should, we should all learn that at school
Absolutely. Yes.
from a young age, but we don't. So it's not being on autopilot, but trying to, trying to think differently about wealth. Um, what surprised you most about the journey from, increasing your salary to actually feeling financially secure or financially free?
Something that really surprised me along that journey was actually how little I was able to speak to friends and sort of my personal circle about money. I was, talking about money with mentors and people that were on a similar journey as me. And I was also talking about money at work because I was working in sales and I would, work on these big multi-million dollar deals. And so it was very natural for me to talk about money. But when it came to certain sort of like personal circles, that was not always the case. I couldn't openly speak about it in the same way. In fact, I would just get comments like, "Oh, look at you living in your fancy flat," or "Look at that shiny car that you drive." So I almost had to like justify my living situation. And it made me realize that our environment really sort of shapes our financial ceiling. It can either expand your horizon to what is possible if you surround yourself with people that are, thinking bigger and that are on a journey, on that financial education journey, or that have achieved what you're looking to achieve. But it can also make you, feel like you need to shrink. And so it's very, very essential to actually surround yourself with people that help you to be your best version and like be curious about the financial education journey that you should be ultimately on.
I have one final question before we go into quick fire. Do you think this kind of change is more about the strategy, the methodology, the tactics, or it's a lot about identity?
I think it's both. I think, me personally, I had to change my identity first of all, believing that I too could be this, financially educated, independent person and version of myself, which then allowed me to actually put a strategy in place that allowed me to really go for it. So as I said earlier, I'm a deep and firm believer of the fact that you can always reverse engineer your goals. And whatever that goal may be. So when I wanted to buy my own house in London, I, did the numbers around that. What does it look like? Paying your mortgage, still living a comfortable life in London. And I came to the realization my salary doesn't allow me to do that. It's not going to help me to actually live a comfortable life whilst paying off my mortgage. So instead of dropping the dream of buying my own house, I knew I now had to work on my salary. So I did. And I, really negotiated my way up over months. I would go and speak to my manager every single week. I would bring up my pay until we eventually came to an agreement, and I managed to, put down the deposit and everything. And, now I live in my beautiful home and I love it. And I earned that house. So I think you can always reverse engineer a goal, and you can put the structure in place, but you need to have the right mindset for that. You need to have shifted your identity in, believing that that's also possible for you, and then just execute and go for it.
Amazing. Thanks, Nicole. 3 quick fire questions. 1 belief you had to unlearn about money.
If you work really hard, the money will automatically follow. It's not the case.
The bravest career move you've made.
It was pivoting completely a couple of years ago and actually starting my own business. So completely leaving sort of security of like a monthly paycheck and now starting my own business and really grinding and starting from scratch. It was a scary step at the time. I'm still on that journey, but it's honestly one of the best decisions ever. And I really, really love how my everyday is just filled with like helping women stepping into leadership roles, negotiating comfortably and with confidence, and helping them to gain that confidence.
1 sentence everyone should remember about asking for a pay rise.
Who doesn't ask doesn't get. You can negotiate absolutely everything.
Amazing. Nicole, thank you. I think that was really empowering, motivating. I love that you also speak in a very, calm way. So I think for everyone, be reassured that you can also do it. You can ask for more money. Just make sure you link it to your goal. But it was fantastic to have you on the studio today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today on The Wallet. You can subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. We also share short clips on social media at Vestpod. And you'll find the key takeaways and resources from this episode at vestpod.com.